Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Productive Disruption. I'm your host, Gabby Denisio. I'm a copywriter here at Rhodes Branding. Today, we are joined by Rebecca Rolland. Rebecca is a speech pathologist, writer, and Harvard lecturer. She is passionate about the power of language and conversation to enhance our relationships. In her latest book, The Art of Talking with Children, she shows you how to enrich your interactions with the kids in your life and build the skills kids really need today to thrive. Rebecca, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
So, as a little bit of background about Rebecca, she is a speech pathologist, a writer, a Harvard lecturer, and is incredibly passionate about the power of language and conversation to enhance our relationships. In her latest book, The Art of Talking with Children, she shows you how to enrich your interactions with the kids in your life and build the skills kids really need to thrive. Once again, thank you so much for being here with us today. How are you today? How's everything going?
It's great. Yes, we're right in the middle of back to school, so everything's been going well, but a bit busy. What about you?
Good. Things have been going good. A little bit chaotic and busy, but all the good things, right? All the good
Yes,
things.
yeah, exactly.
So, just to kick us off a little bit, I want to start with your career, more specifically, where your interest in speech pathology began. Can you walk us through that story?
Definitely, yeah. So I met several young kids earlier in my life who were having a lot of trouble learning to speak, and some kids actually who were speaking but were not intelligible. They had a kind of disorder where they were using a lot of words, but no one, even their mother, couldn't understand them. And I saw when talking with these kids how much their lives were affected by communication. And that really brought home to me. They had troubles with friendships, they had troubles in their family. And I saw even after getting therapy and speech therapy how they blossomed and how much it sort of changed their entire perspectives, and then also who they even seemed as kids. They even came across differently and had different confidence level. And to me, that was really inspiring because it made me realize that we don't always think about speech and communication as being so fundamental to children's lives and to our lives as adults. And that made me really inspired to think about, well, how can I support other kids in going through that journey as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So, did you have that first experience when you were in high school, when you were a teenager? So, when did you realize that this was an issue and that you were going to pursue a career?
Yes, I would say it's interesting. I actually moved to Greece right after I got my first master's in English, and I was teaching there. And so I met a lot of students there who were having some difficulties speaking Greek, but even difficulties speaking English as well. And so I got really interested in sort of that question of bilingual education and how to tell whether a child is just having trouble speaking in general or whether it's a language learning issue. And I actually came out of a moment of frustration because I realized I didn't know almost anything about how to help them. So I sort of saw these challenges and saw what was happening, but I knew I didn't have the skills to help those students. And so to me, that kind of question and that sense of what else can I be doing was really what led me on the journey.
How long were you in Greece for? How long did you teach there?
For a
A
year.
year. Okay, so you go for a year, and then that's when you
Yeah.
make the decision of, okay, I want to study this a little bit more. And
Mhm.
then when you come back to the States, and that's when you enrolled in, is this your second master's or this is where you got your
Mhm.
PhD?
Yes, that was my second master. So that's when I decided I applied while I was in Greece to speech pathology master's programs. And I got accepted to one, and then I entered it right after moving back to Boston. So that was really that process. It was a little bit of a culture shock, but it was a really intensive program, and I think really, really exciting because I got to meet so many different adults and children with communication difficulties and see it firsthand. It's very sort of in depth and very applied program. So I got to really do that interactive work very early on.
That's so wonderful too to kind of to be not thrown in, but like thrown in the most positive
Mhm.
sense to really see
Yeah,
what the job entailed, what the impact you
exactly.
could make was. I have a question that might
Yeah.
feel a little bit loaded. It's a big question, so feel free to answer it however
Sure.
you see fit. When do you think you first identified if there's a specific moment or a story that you really understood and realized that there is extreme power in language?
Yes, I think, well, so it's interesting because as a young child and even still now, I've always written poetry and I've actually published um, three collections of poems and I have a fourth coming up next year. So for me, language has always been a passion of mine at sort of the individual level. I've always been really interested in how our emotions can be communicated in language. So that aspect of it was really early, in the sense that I was always reading poems, always writing them and performing them with my friends. But as I grew older, and especially as I sort of saw what I kind of call the poetry of everyday life, just like people's language and how much their expressions are kind of poetic and listening to dialogue was so fascinating to me. And I remember still one moment working with a stroke patient who had aphasia. So it's a word finding disorder. And we were doing, he could almost not speak at all. And we were doing what's called music intonation therapy. So you hold a patient's hand and you start tapping out the beats of familiar songs and singing along with it. So things like Happy Birthday, old songs that they might know from childhood. And I remember this man who was really kind of gruff and was not speaking almost at all. And it felt sort of awkward to do this because it felt like, well, I don't know if this is, if he's going to just push away, doesn't like this, nothing comes of it. But I still remember sitting in that room and sort of we're holding hands and tapping out these beats, and he started to sing. And you could just see this smile and this sort of, you know, thrilled expression that came over his face to kind of hear himself in a way very fluidly that he had not been able to do for a couple of years and maybe not for some time. And just to see that and kind of to see the transformation that it can have, even something so simple, to feel as if he was part of this language community again and he could make his expressions known and in a musical form. To me, that was really powerful and inspiring, both about language but even about music as well.
What a really beautiful connection to have. Or, just to
Hmm.
have shared that moment or experience with somebody. Like, to me, that, like, just gives me chills, like, knowing that
Yeah.
you witnessed something like that. Like, I think that was just such a really special thing to be a part of.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's what's so interesting. People don't hear, like, they hear speech pathology and they don't always think of these sort of personal moments and these constant personal connections as you're supporting someone to gain communication skills. And I think that's what's most interesting to me and most powerful is to see those kind of breakthroughs.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So to continue on with our trend of the power of language, and in this case, the power of the written word, your book, The Art of Talking with Children, I had the opportunity to read through it, and I'm really excited to talk more about it. Starting, of course, my one of my initial interests is what was the impetus? What was the kind of the light bulb moment for you where you were like, "I'm gonna write this book?" Whatever it was in the first draft, right? But just that initial
Mhm.
feeling of, "Okay, this is the next step for me."
Yes. Yeah. So it's really started with a story. And the story was that it was in the book, but I was sitting with my daughter in the Museum of Fine Arts, and she was about 5 years old. And she loved going to the mummies. So we were going to see the mummies. And we've been sitting there for some time. And she asked me a question, just where did the mummies
Mhm.
go? And I wasn't quite sure what she meant.
This is a cute
And I said,
story.
yeah, I was like, they're here. I don't know what you mean. And she's like, no, I mean, where do they go? Like their minds or their spirits or something. And I said, well, I don't know. What do you think? And I realized I had typically given her answers like to the questions. I didn't typically say, well, I don't know. But we just sat with that silence. And she said, well, I don't know. And I want to know where they were before they were born. And I said, well, that I really don't know. And then we got into this conversation about where we were before we were born. And I said, I had no idea, and I wanted to know what she thought. And she looked at me and she thought for a while, and she said, I think I used to be an old man, and I got sick of being so old, and so I turned into a baby again. And she just said it completely straight faced. And I was like, do you think so? She's like, I really think that's what happened. And to me, I was just sort of astounded because I mean, she's a typical 5 year old. Now she's 10. And she did not normally talk like that. And I didn't normally sort of hear those kind of really philosophical and thought provoking ideas come from her. And as somebody who loves conversation and loves language, I just had this light bulb moment of thinking, wow, that was really incredible to have that moment and to have her see herself stretch in that way. And how can we have more of these meaningful and funny and interesting conversations in our daily lives? And I knew so much from research, but I didn't see
Right.
that in the world of parenting or education literature. So I wanted to really go on that journey.
There's a phrase that you use in the book called rich talk. Can you talk a little bit about exactly what that is, and why it's so beneficial to children?
Yeah, so really the rich talk is a result of this journey I went on to try to figure out, well, how can we actually put these meaningful conversations into strategies? How can we make this work when we're busy, we're rushed, everyone has a lot of priorities. And so rich talk are kind of the three principles that can be applied in lots of different situations. The first is adaptive. So this just means really going with the flow of the child, whether it's in the moment. So things like the child's mood, when and where they most like to talk, or they most open up, with whom, which activity, and even longer term, thinking about their temperaments. What kind of activity works for them? When is it best kind of to be quiet and step away? What do they most prefer? So that's the A. The B is back and forth. So I actually titled the book "The Art of Talking with Children" because I think it's so important to find that balance between the adult talking and the child talking. Um, I've seen so often that we talk at kids without even intending to, or that we are having kind of two different conversations and we're not actually meeting each other to see eye to eye. So that back and forth is really intended to create a flow so we feel more in sync with the children in our lives. And the C is child driven. So I've really found in my work and my research that starting with a child's frame of reference, so what they're interested in or curious about or scared about, is a much more powerful way to have these more meaningful conversations than it is if we start from somewhere we're thinking about. That doesn't mean permissive teaching or permissive parenting, but really just getting inside a child's head and asking questions that really explore what is this child interested in right now? Not actually just age and stage, but really moment to moment. Can we find that flow of the child's interest and help them expand it?
There are two comments I have from this. And the first is that as you were speaking, the thing that came up to me almost immediately is how much this could still be applied for people of our same age. Like when we say it's
Mm,
for children, I also think there's so much value in how we apply this in our, in our work relationships, our romantic relationships and
sure.
friendships, of this whole idea of I think sometimes we
Hmm.
get into a habit maybe of, like you said, talking to rather than talking with, and having them be just as equal part of the conversation. And then in terms of understanding where they're at, you tell a story in the book, or there's a section in the book about, um, I think it was maybe a mom who had her child go to a chart and would
Mm-hmm.
identify the emotions that way. And I think there was maybe a story or a specific anecdote where she says, you know, I maybe thought he was sad, but he pointed to lonely, right? And so how we're
Hmm.
not always able to understand, or really should we, because we're our own person. It's hard to understand where somebody is
Exactly.
always feeling or coming from. And that really stood out to me, and I could definitely see the connection from, an activity like that to exactly what you're talking about here.
Yeah, definitely. And I've seen that so often with kids, and questions that we ask that we sometimes think are helpful and are well intended. So if you ask a child who's younger, for example, they seem downcast, and you say, "Oh, you're sad, right?" And they might just nod their head because, it's sad is kind of the general category.
Right.
That's sort of right, but not exactly. But if you can have these conversations, and sometimes definitely with pictures or help to point at charts or other things that they can point at, it can be such a richer conversation, and then you can actually figure out how to help the child more. So I've seen so many kids who, they're not sad, they're lonely because they miss their friend that moved away. Okay, so that means something different. At that point you can think about, well, can we call the friend or something, rather than just well, I'm sad. Let's just go have dinner, something like that. So you actually can think about, well, what strategies could help you with this emotion? What can we actually do in practice to help you feel better when you get more specific around what the emotion is and then also why it's caused?
I listened to a Brene Brown podcast probably a few months ago, right when the Atlas of the Heart came out. Did you ever read that?
Mhm. Yes, yes, it's a great book.
Well, and in one of the podcasts, she says, and I don't think I'm butchering
Mhm.
this, but she says, we as adults can typically only name like 3 emotions at a time.
Mhm.
And so I wonder when, we talk about, well, are you feeling sad? Well, no, I'm feeling lonely. And maybe it's a subset of it, but sad, like you said, it's so general, but it's an easy go-to,
Yeah.
right? And so I also think there's so much power in helping kids identify beyond 3, right? Happy,
Yeah.
sad, or mad of all
Exactly.
like the ranges of emotions that you can feel and experience and go through. And I imagine when we start to have these conversations with children now, you're prepping them to be really, really emotionally intelligent teenagers, adults, partners, colleagues. Like
Mhm.
there's so much benefit in it. And even when you look at the word rich, right? The difference between rich talk and talk, it's so
Mhm.
extraordinary. And I
Yeah.
almost want to compare it to like active listening and listening as
Hmm.
well. That's
Yes. Yeah.
that's kind of where my brain goes. Um,
Definitely. Mhm.
but it is, it's
Yeah, and I
it's
do.
fascinating.
Yeah, and I do emphasize kind of that active listening part as a key part of this talk because yes, if you're not listening actively, I think it is really hard to actually know, well, how is this person responding to me? Am I just hearing an answer and moving on? And even I love that idea of that raising emotionally intelligent children through this early on process because even things like mixed emotions. So there's a lot of research showing that children can identify other people having mixed emotions, but they have trouble explaining, say, when they feel more than one thing at once. So most of the time, we don't always feel one thing. Like we're not just lonely, we're not just sad. We might be lonely and sleepy, or we might be excited and nervous. And so kids often, and sometimes adults, struggle to identify this combination of feelings. And so I think part of becoming more emotionally literate is about talking about multiple things going on at the same time and helping kids to do that too. So I think it's a lot of nuance, but I think it is so critical in raising those kids to be emotionally intelligent.
Yeah. For parents or for teachers or for anybody who assumes that parent role, are there any question stems or, almost like a starter pack, if you will, for that
Mm-hmm.
adult in that child's life to get this conversation going and shifting from talk to rich talk? Are there any key questions that we can be asking?
Yes, definitely. So if you're looking, so there's definitely like a whole appendix in the book, luckily, where I've laid out by ages and stages suggested questions, suggested conversations, things like that. So recognizing that any family, is different, but that some of these can be very useful. So if you want an in-depth look, is there. But I think there are some key ones that I would really emphasize asking, especially if you're thinking about playing with language and being more creative. So two of them are, how might we do something, or what would happen if something. So, for example, if a child is playing with a toy robot and they say, "Oh, the robot's running away," you might ask something like, "Well, what would happen if the robot was 3 times bigger?" Or what would happen if we added this part to it? So you're helping the child kind of think about how things are and then how they might be, or how might we make this robot go faster? How might we do that? And that actually can translate to emotions as well. So even thinking about first identifying how children are feeling, and then exploring, well, what would happen if we did this? How might that make you feel? How about we try this? So you're sort of helping and modeling for a child ideas of strategies, and then checking in with them about how that might feel. So rather than actually just reacting, we're sort of proactively thinking through options and helping a child actually evaluate and think about, brainstorm for themselves. And over time, this can make them much more independent and feeling like, oh, I actually can brainstorm on my own.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I think a big piece of this is all the positive ways that children can be influenced by these types of conversations. Let's talk about the other side of that, though, the downside. If a child or a student is not exposed to quality conversation, they're not exposed to rich talk. What are some of the disadvantages that you might notice in your research about somebody like this?
Yeah, so I think there's a range of things. The start is with learning. So I really see that rich talk impacts all areas of a child's life. So everything from learning to their social life to their well being mentally and so on. But even thinking about learning, if students or children are not exposed to rich talk and are not asked kind of these bigger questions, they often learn a lot of information. They kind of acquire facts, but they're not actually able to think very critically or creatively. So they kind of end up being very much in the box and being very stuck. At the same time, I've seen so many kids in my practice and then also just out in the world who are facing a lot of anxiety and stress. A lot of kids, and I actually recently gave a talk at a gallery, and a woman said to me, my children are very anxious, and I'm actually tend to be an anxious and perfectionistic person. And so I think we also, as a culture, have a lot of anxiety and perfectionism because, in part, there's many causes, but I think in part, we aren't playing around with ideas. We're not accepting this brainstorming kind of framework. We're really often thinking about, well, did you get it right or was it wrong? Does it have to be perfect or is it a failure? So, really thinking in these black and white terms and not actually considering the emotions or the process behind learning and interacting. So, I do think that given kind of all of the mental health issues we're talking about now, all of the adult mental health issues, I think it's so important that we do move towards the rich talk as much as we can.
Yeah. Yeah. You said something that reminded me of a student when I was in the classroom that, um, I taught English. And so there was a lot of more creativity that I could
Hmm.
have, say, if I was teaching math, right?
Hmm.
And if I did not give explicit, specific instructions on an essay or on a creative project, especially at
Hmm.
my honors level, I would have kids who would come up and, need the rubric down to a T. And it
Yes,
reminded me
yes.
so much of how I was when I was in high school too, because of that sense of I've got to get it right. It has to be perfect rather than feeling that you had that window. Even if I was affirming or validating, get creative, have a little bit of fun with it. I
Right.
think that
Right.
idea, at least what I noticed at the high school level, was really difficult for them to tap into, and I think it is, like you said, a lot of it is probably attributed to the stress, the perfectionism, the pressure that comes with getting into whatever college. Some of the kids had a lot
Right.
of pressure coming directly from their parents. So it's interesting because I've noticed a lot of these things in education, and I'm sure you have as well.
Definitely. Yes. And I've worked with so many kids like that who just feel as though I asked, let's write something. Their first question is, how long does it have to be? And the second question is, like, can I make sure I'm doing it exactly right? So I
Yeah.
want to actually know exactly how to do this so it's perfect before I even get started. So, yes, I think we've lost kind of the point. I'm obviously a creative writer too. And I often think about the point of writing is communication. It's not to be perfect or to put all of the periods in, although that's important too. But the big point is what is the message? What are you trying to communicate and what should the form be? And I think that needs to be the primary conversation with kids because it often gets lost totally. I mean, I've seen in so many classes and in schools that it is so focused on rote learning and high stakes testing and so on.
Yeah, yeah. I think I've told this story on the podcast once before, but my senior year of high school, I had an AP statistics teacher who it was the first time at this point I'm 17, 18 years old. I've been in school. I did pre-K, so it was God knows how old that was, right? But my whole life up
Right.
until that point, and this was the first teacher. This was the hardest class I ever took, college included, and I think we all, the whole class, like, failed the first test, and she, like, hands back everybody's test, and she's like, "I already talked to guidance. You can't drop this class just because you failed a test." She goes, "I want you to be in here, and I want you to learn something." And she dropped an expletive. "I don't
Yeah.
give a what you make in here. I just want you to learn something." And I
That's
remember
great.
my
Yeah.
first thought, similarly to what we said, I was like, I gotta go to
Yeah.
college. There's no way I'm
Mhm.
passing this AP test. I gotta do good in here, you know? But
Mhm.
what she was trying to say is like, you can just try to learn it and listen. And that shift was huge for me. And I tried to apply it in any college course I took and any job I had to, of just like, it's the first draft. It's not supposed to be perfect. It's just supposed to be. And whatever that is okay. But it's
Yes.
hard.
Mhm. It's hard. And I do think it starts with, I mean, it's a sort of cultural shift too, because I think those kids are getting it from parents, and we're all getting it from somewhere else, from college pressure. And so I totally sympathize with that feeling of, oh, I need to get into college. It needs to be a high grade and all of this. But so I think it's going to take some shift to feel as though we actually move in that direction. And especially to help kids and parents and teachers realize that if you're having these conversations, kids will learn more,
Yeah.
actually, kind of as you're saying. You learn more skills, and you probably learn more than if you had dropped out due to fear about, not getting a perfect score. So
Oh,
I do think it's a big
and I
shift.
would have been that kid too. I remember seeing that, I think it
Right.
was like a 54 come across my desk, and I remember my first thought was like, "I'm out. We're out of here." You
Yeah,
know?
exactly. No, I've been there. I
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. Oh my god, it's the worst. It will still, like, give me a pit in my stomach.
Oh yeah, no. I mean, I have math class memories myself. So.
With most of our audience being in, the education space, I want to shift and talk a little bit more about something you wrote about early on in the book, which was the classroom climate and something you were able to observe. Was it in your PhD program? Was it as you were working?
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, so it was so yeah, sorry, go ahead.
no, just curious about what you found from that and why that became such an important thing that you
Mhm.
wanted to study.
Yeah, so it actually was part of my work towards my doctorate. And I was really interested in actually, I had a theory that the way the classroom functioned kind of as a
Mm.
unit, how warm it felt as an environment, how children felt about being there, had a really big impact on their education, but even their motivation and their well being. And I kind of sensed that as a speech pathologist, I was going into lots and lots of classrooms to observe. And I noticed that some children just seemed to blossom in some classrooms, and those same children seemed so shut down and so unwilling to speak, one period later. And I just couldn't figure out why. And I really thought there had to be something more about classrooms that we weren't looking at. So my master's thesis was a really big kind of study of studies where I looked at how much classroom climate, or kind of the way the classroom feels warm or supportive or not, does change or impact children's learning, their motivation, and kind of where those links are. And I found that in so many instances, there's a mastery climate, which is a climate where students feel as if mistakes are a part of a learning journey. They feel as though it's okay not to be perfect. It's okay to show you don't know the answer. And that kind of climate linked to so many positive factors for students. So everything from their achievement to their motivation to succeed, even to their motivation just intrinsically to enjoy the subject. Whereas the opposite, so a performance climate where it was all about who was best, who was first, linked to a lot more negative outcomes for students. And I found that actually sixth grade was a really big difference, where it was much more positive if there was a mastery climate, and much more negative if there was a performance climate. And I still don't have an answer exactly to why that is, but I've really theorized that it has to do maybe with the fact that children at that age are very aware of others' performance, and they're very sort of sensitive and vulnerable to feelings of you're better than me, or I'm better than she is, and that kind of thing. So that actually to attend to that sense of helping all children feel okay to learn, to fail, and that success comes through that process, I think is something that came a lot out of my research.
That's interesting, especially the 6th grade comment as well.
Mm-hmm.
I would be curious, like,
Yes.
yeah, I'd be curious to know exactly if we could ever pinpoint it. And I wonder too, did you ever notice the same in ninth grade? I'm almost thinking of that transition into that new
Mm.
school or that new kind of phase where you're
Yes.
the underdog again.
Yes, I actually, it's funny. I didn't study that in that study, but I actually have worked in a high school
Mm.
for students that was specialized in students with language or learning disabilities. And I did notice that a lot in high school, that there was, especially ninth grade, seemed to be a year where there's a lot of sort of totem pole, like who's better than whom, who's in the cool club, who's not. And actually, one thing I noticed, and I think is almost a good marker of this, is that when I would come into classrooms, so I was sort of the special education support person in some ways. So when I would come into classrooms to take a student out of class to do, one-on-one or small group work, there would be a huge difference in some classrooms, the reaction of other students. And I always started to use that as kind of a beacon to understand what the classroom climate was like. In some classrooms, there would be just almost nothing happen. It was totally normal. It was fine. The other students didn't look or, even smiled and waved and said hi to me and, waved the child off. In other classrooms, there was this like really sense of doom and snickering and muttering about, how this child wasn't smart or how this child had a problem. And you could see the look on the child's face of like, oh, I can't believe I'm having to do this. So it impacted my work with the student, but it also served to me as a really good lesson in kind of how a classroom can be created to be accepting of those kind of differences and need for support, or it can feel like, oh, this is a really big stigma. So I think teachers have a huge opportunity to promote that kind of inclusivity in their classrooms and not feel as if, if there is that kind of environment, it's possible to change it. And I think that's what came away for me as a really big factor.
Let's dive into that a little bit more. So, if we have a teacher listening or if we have administration listening, you know, the first day can be very overwhelming, right? There's, as from the student standpoint, from the teacher standpoint, you're go, go, go. You're just trying to figure it out. But I
Mm-hmm.
always felt that that first day was really important in setting the tone or at least beginning to build a
Yeah.
foundation
Mm-hmm.
for what the semester would look like or the year, depending on what you taught.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
for our folks in education, for that first day, what are some things that teachers can say, or if there's an activity that teachers can do that really promotes that idea of it's not about being the best, it's not about getting the best scores, it's simply about coming, trying, and just figuring it out.
Hmm. Yeah, so I think a couple things. One thing I think is really to talk about how we all learn on a kind of spectrum. So all of us have our own strengths and weaknesses, and we can identify them even as adults. So even to model and talk through, what is a challenge for you? What is something you shine at? I've said to students like, oh, I'm really good at kind of verbal expression. Like I can write papers really quickly, but if I need to do geometry, for me, I have a lot of trouble with that. So even as an adult who's managed to go to graduate school, I have these kind of strengths and weaknesses, and it all varies. So none of us is a typical learner. So if somebody needs to have support in one area, that might mean that you need support in a different area at a different time. And we all can support each other with these differences. So I really talk about, rather than hiding differences and trying to pretend as if we're all the same or there's some people who are typical learners and some who are atypical, I really talk about everybody as an individual and how all of our strengths and challenges can support each other. So I think that's a really helpful activity to just ask a student, even to be kind of self aware about, well, coming into this year, what do you see as kind of your biggest strengths, both academically, but even to give to the community in terms of, what are you a great friend to people? Are you great at meeting new people? And actually, if they feel comfortable to share that with a small group or to share it with the class. And is there an area they like to grow in? So to actually promote that idea that we all want to grow in something and that we can all support each other to do that. I think that's a really key framing.
Yeah, yeah, and I think to have those conversations earlier rather than later are so, so important, and so
Hmm.
thinking about when this
Yeah,
episode comes out, it will likely be in November, and so with the beauty of that is that we're getting close to maybe that second part of the year for
hmm,
some teachers and
yeah,
even for some administrators in terms of just kinda taking a check of how this first semester went and some of the changes that you can make next semester, and I
exactly.
think this would be really
Yeah.
great to incorporate if at all possible.
for sure.
One other thing that you mentioned, and I feel like there's a lot of reasons. Well, you've mentioned a bunch of things. I wish we could go through all of it too. Um, but one thing that stood out to me, especially because I feel like, at least in my adulthood, if you will, I've seen a lot on the growth mindset. And that's something that you touch on in the book as well. Why is that growth mindset versus the fixed mindset so important for students to adapt early on?
Yes, I think so. Having a growth mindset, which is just this idea that intelligence isn't fixed, that we can learn and grow with effort, it's so important because it underlies everything a student does. It really supports them to persist, to engage, even if they've failed, and to take that decision after they have a challenge to try again, to try differently. So this applies to all areas of their lives. It might be sports. So rather than saying, "Oh, I'm not good at soccer, I'm quitting," they might say, "Oh, I'm really my kicking skills are not what I thought they were. I need to work on that." Or in math, I'm not a math person. I can't do math. That kind of thinking can persist with a child throughout their lives and make them feel like, oh, well, I'll never be good at that. I'm going to avoid that as a career. I'm going to avoid that in my personal life. And so to have a growth mindset, it impacts children's learning, obviously, but it really also impacts how they feel about themselves. To get that sense of, well, I'm not good at this yet, but I could be good at it. It's such more of an optimistic perspective and a sort of forward looking perspective than saying, oh, I'll just never be good at it, so forget it. So I think if we want to raise students and children who are not kind of defeatist and feeling as if, oh, I need to quit because it's not going well, I think that the growth mindset is one of the key things to work on.
When I would introduce essay units, if it was the first one we had done, I would start with the question of, let me see a show of hands if you genuinely at some point have enjoyed writing. I'd get a handful of
Mm-hmm.
students, right? And so I would say, okay, raise your hand if you
Mm-hmm.
absolutely hate this. The idea of doing an essay makes you want to crawl inside yourself
Mm-hmm.
right now. So hands would shoot up,
Yes.
and I would say, okay, keep
Mm-hmm.
your hand up if at some point somebody told you you were a bad writer. And I would have a few
Mm-hmm.
hands go down, but majority of my room had their hands up. And that's
Mm-hmm.
where I would start,
Wow.
where I
Mm-hmm.
would say, okay, so we're going to
Yeah.
first try
Yeah.
to dismantle that idea, and then we're going to go into the subject.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so, from my
Yeah.
perspective, I always thought it was really important to get an idea of where they were coming from as writers. This is the
Mm-hmm.
example that I can use,
That's
but I
great.
think as teachers, there's a lot of different, I was the kid who I distinctly remember a teacher telling me that I was really bad at math from 10th grade geometry. I'm horrible at math, don't put me in,
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so I
Yeah.
think
Mm-hmm.
for
Exactly.
us to understand those things about ourselves, but also with the people that we're interacting with is really, really important and can contribute to that mindset at the end of the day.
Definitely.
Yeah. With that said too, you mentioned this idea of, how do we praise efforts and why it's so much more important to praise efforts rather than praising a person. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that concept?
Yeah, so there's wonderful research on what's called the praise paradox, which means that, especially for kids with lower self esteem or who already feel not so great about themselves, we often tend to overpraise. So, say a child brings home, a drawing that's a little messy and not quite what they maybe could do typically, and they say, "Oh, look at this." And to kind of support them, we may say something like, "Oh, that's so fabulous," or "Oh, that's just incredible," and actually, that kind of overpraise has been found to be counterproductive. So children actually do less and they have lower self esteem when they're given more of that kind of praise. And especially for students who start out with low self esteem. And the thinking behind that is that a child who already has low self esteem senses that, okay, I don't think this work was the best thing I've ever done. And there's this big gap between how I see my work and this kind of over praise that I'm hearing. And that doesn't actually make me feel better about myself. It makes me distrust what I'm hearing and seeing. And then also just to figure out, well, I'm not sure anymore of whether I should trust my own judgment or trust the judgment of this person who's giving me kind of effusive praise. So, actually, what's much more effective is to really be specific about praise. So, what you actually liked or appreciated, but even to help a child articulate what they like about something. So I'll often ask kids, for example, well, how was this for you to make? What about it, especially thinking of the effort, what about it took you the longest? What about it are you most proud of? And those kind of questions can help a child start to self evaluate. So they become their own judge rather than that typical, child running to you like, how is this? How is that? What do you think? It's not bad that they run to you, but they shouldn't be seeing you as the only judge, I think. So that's where those questions come in.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that was, I remember reading that and just being like, oh my God, that's so true. That's so important.
Yeah, I know. I feel like I've seen everyone's done that, I think, and I'm the same. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. All right. So to start to wrap us up, I'm going to put you in the hot seat. Okay. So I'm going to ask you 2 questions. With each of them, I want it to be your gut response. Okay. So the first one that
Okay.
comes to your head. So the first question is, what was the most difficult part about writing your book?
I think really the hardest part was staring at the blank page. So I submitted a proposal, which was just about 50 pages, and it was accepted.
Just about
And so
50
then I
pages.
thought, yeah, so, well, I mean, 50 pages is not 300 pages.
Fair. Fair.
And so I thought, okay, I've got to start. Where should I start? I think that was just, and I noticed, I think that's what so many students also face is that sense of, oh, I have this assignment. What do I even do? Where's a good start? And so I actually started in the middle. I realized that I couldn't start with the start, and I ended up at the start eventually.
I can just picture like the blank page, the blinking cursor, and you're just like, oh God, what do I
Exactly.
do?
Like, oh, wow. That's, yeah.
So, flip side, what has been the most rewarding part about writing a book?
I would say actually talking with people about it afterwards has been so fun, and to see the ways people are adapting the strategies to their own lives. So I really suggest I lay out all these strategies, and then I suggest, you should really adapt them to your classrooms, to your life, what makes sense for you. Because obviously every culture of talk is different. So I think it's been so fun to see such a diversity of opinions, and just people from all over the world talking to me about how they're using it.
All right, last question. If you could wave a magic wand, what is one thing that you would change about education?
Hmm. I think this is kind of abstract, but I think I would change this idea that more is more. So I think that we often think, for example, with young kids, I've seen so much taking away recess,
Mm.
taking away things that make a whole child healthy and well, with the idea that we're going to put more information or more education into them faster. And I think that's just such a dangerous mindset and so counterproductive when we think about children's well-being and even their learning. So I would want to pull back on that and to realize that children need lots of things at every age.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Rebecca, where can people find your book? Where can they find you if they have any other questions or want to connect?
Yes, definitely. So I have a website, which is just RebeccaRolland.com, 2 C's in Rebecca and 2 L's in Roland. They can also find my book through the website or on Amazon. It's published by HarperCollins as well, so they can find it through their website.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate your conversation so much.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate it also.